All right. Well, I'd love to welcome to the Private Practice Elevation podcast, Nate Hendrikse. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. I apologize. It's taken us like 2, 3 months to get this scheduled and rescheduled with summer. And,
Yep.
the summer situation with two kids is always really tricky with childcare, and then childcare cancels or someone gets sick
hmm
or just the schedule just totally changes. So thank you so much for your flexibility, Nate. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's the beauty of summer, right? We have two kids as well, so I totally get it. And I know both of us, I think, probably canceled once or twice, and that's just how it goes in summer. But that's a good thing. It means
Yeah.
we're doing things and we're busy, right? So
Yeah.
all good.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's hear a little bit more about you. I want to as we were just talking about before we hit record here, what I always love about podcasts is just hearing people's stories and just learning more about, just amazing things that people are doing in the world. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and take us kind of back to, a little bit about your journey of how you got to be doing what you're doing today.
Yeah. Happy to. Yeah, so my name's Nate. As you said, I own Navigator Bookkeeping, live in Tinley Park, Illinois, which is Chicago suburbs. So, we get all the forms of weather all the time, which is the fun part about the Midwest. But yeah, I started the company about 6 years ago. But before that, I actually was a teacher. So you just mentioned your son who's going into second grade. I taught third
Yeah,
grade
cool.
for 4 years actually. So I got out of college, did that for 4 years, and a lot of fun, a lot of fun interactions. Going to do a lot of silly things when you're a third grade teacher, but also was just kind of not my thing. It was pretty stressful to me as far as the
Mm.
classroom management, things like that. Like I remember coming home to my wife every day and she'd be like, "How's your day?" It's like it was really bad. It's really stressful. And like you do that for a couple of years and you're pretty quickly like, all right, I need to do something else. So
Yeah,
um there's a lot of good with that. Like I think I grew a lot as a person and learned how to do a lot of things as far as obviously teaching skills, but just multitasking, managing stress. But um 2 years into that, I was like, okay, I need to do something else. I can't do this for a full career. I don't want to be kind of like a bitter teacher who's just kind of
yeah,
struggling through it,
yeah.
right? Um, so yeah, started looking into other work. I've always loved personal finance, like even in college, in high school, I was always like listening to finance podcasts. I mean, like, oh man, like budgeting, super fun for me. Which is super, super lame. I know that most people are like, "Are you serious?" But I loved
I love
personal
it too.
finance. All right, yeah, you get it. Um, so I was like, I want to do something with finance if I can, but my wife is a nurse, so she had kind of this weird schedule. So I was like, I don't want to just be working kind of like your normal 9 to 5, 8 to 4,
Yeah.
whatever it is, or even finance has usually very long hours. So I was like, I don't want to have this big blocked off schedule. I want to be able to see her do things, have flexibility. So I was like, how do I start a business in finance without having a finance background? It's like this is odd. So after
Mm.
some searching and such, I found some courses, started taking some schooling on bookkeeping and accounting and kind of the business side. And basically was like, all right, I'm going to start a business. So I have that flexibility, but I also still get to do kind of the finance side of it. So
Yeah.
um, to me, bookkeeping is like personal finance for businesses, right? It's like, hey, let's chat about where you are financially and how we can keep moving in the right direction. So to me, it kind of checked all those boxes. And yeah, that was about 6 years ago. Started the business. It was super funny. I was so excited to get into business and get away from teaching. I was like, everything was great, right?
Hmm.
So I started the business in June. Did not sign my first client until November, and I was 0% worried the whole time. I was like, "This is great. I love every minute of this. I'm having so much fun." And my wife
Yeah.
told me afterwards, she's like, "Yeah, I was freaking out. I was like,
Yeah.
when are these clients coming in? I didn't feel that at
Yeah.
all." So
Wow.
it's funny looking back at that, but yeah, that was 6 years ago. Um, we started working with just kind of all different businesses, and in the last 2 to 3 years or so, we really niched down into private practice specifically, which has been really a fun phase of the business. Like that, the last 2 to 3 years has been exponentially more enjoyable because we've been able to really get deep into the industry and really just
Yeah.
meet a lot of people, make a lot of repeated connections, go to conferences, and just really get deep into private practice and learn about kind of where practices are, what they're dealing with, how they work, and how we can help them. And that's been a really um, fun move that happened a couple of years ago. So since then, just really been diving deep in there and kind of growing and building the business specifically into private practices and kind of going in that direction. So
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. I love that you saw this isn't working for me, and which I could never ever teach a class of third graders. Like that is just so not my so not my thing. So kudos for even trying it. But like listening to, what you felt was, you needed that change there. And I also just wanted to mention too, I have a very similar story in launching my own business in that I was burnt out with what I was doing and really wanted to start my own business. And so I started back then it was called Create My Therapist website. And
Mm.
I didn't have any clients, same sort of thing. I was like, I'm stepping out, I'm doing this thing. My wife was pregnant with our son Samuel. So at the same thing, like, and I was like, coming home from my 9 to 5 and working on the side gig. And it was just like, this is awesome. This is so much fun. I did sign a client before like my last day at that 9 to 5,
Mm.
but my wife will say like, I really wish you waited longer. And that was really a really stressful time for me. I was like, yeah, sorry about that. So I totally get it. But it's funny how like, these things that you get passionate about that really helps you fuel, getting into, the new venture that you're working on, and then you get to kind of figure out along the way, and love how you niche down. And I think like, what we're going to be talking about today, is you're talking about like for therapists who are looking to scale. We were chatting before we hit record here about how, I talk to a lot of people who are they're usually like a solo practitioner, and they want to start building a team. They want to start growing and scaling things. And so I'm sure that, as you're going to mention, there's a lot of nuances to that when it comes to the financial side of things. And what I really loved about looking at your website, which we'll have in the show notes, encourage everyone to check that out. You talk about a financial story. Like, what is your financial story telling about you and your practice? So why don't we start kind of unpacking that? Like, what do you mean by the financial story?
Mhm.
And then, what sort of things do we want to be looking at for someone who's looking to scale and grow their practice?
Sure. Yeah, financial story is kind of a term that we came up with just as we talked to more and more practice owners, as far as thinking about, how do we kind of describe what we do in a way that makes sense, right? And we're like, okay,
Yeah.
financial story, it's that kind of common thread of what's happening in your business financially, but it's more than just the numbers. When I say to practice owners, like, we're going to help you find your financial story, when I say that, I don't mean you're going to know exactly how much you spent on office supplies last month, or you're going to have memorized your average profit margin. Like, we're not getting into you memorizing numbers. What it
Hmm.
means is understanding what's causing what you're feeling right now, right? So if
Hmm.
you're like, man, I feel like we're doing really well right now, we're kind of cruising. It's like, okay, well, what are the trends that are happening that are causing that? What happened the last 3 to 6 months that caused that? What's happening right now? And what does the future look like? And what do we need to do to keep that financial story moving? Because, finances sometimes get turned into kind of like a black and white, like good or bad, profit or nonprofit thing. But
Yeah.
it's really, in my mind, all these decisions that you made months ago, moving and changing things and creating where you are right now, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of where that financial story comes from. So it's a little bit of that education teaching background in me, but I love teaching people how to find that financial story, and also realize that they have, the ability to change that story, right? Because I think
Hmm.
sometimes, as business owners, as practice owners, it sometimes can feel like you're kind of stuck with whatever story you've been given, right? You're like, we're just kind of always going to be low profit margin, or it's just the industry, or like it's just our location. And
Yeah.
there's some truth to some of those things, but I think also the cool part about a financial story is, once you start realizing what's causing the trends, you also then can start making moves and taking action to improve that financial story. And the hard part is, it may not change the financial story right away, like next month or
Hmm.
2 months, but it can change it, 3, 6 months, 9 months down the road. So that next year, when you're looking at your numbers, you're like, wow, we're in a really different place than we were last year at the same point. And that's really fun to see from our perspective, right? When we're meeting with clients, we're like, hey, remember where you
Yeah.
were last year at this point? Like, I
Hmm.
know you're still not at your goals, but like, remember how tight that was last year? Now we have so much more space, so much more breathing room, right? So that financial story just kind of weaves through a lot of what we do. And I think it's just a helpful kind of, almost like a visualization, to think of like, how where's the business financially? How do we change things? How do we move it? And how does it all kind of connect? Because finance really has a lot of those kind of connecting threads through it. When you're looking at all the numbers, they can feel just like
Yeah.
on islands, like office supplies, rent, revenue, how are those all connected? But you can quickly see like, oh, if we change visits, that changes revenue, which changes profit, and it all is a thread through all of it. So just kind of a nice, I think, methodology to kind of think through all that.
Yeah, I love that. And I love kind of your starting point of like what what is causing how you're feeling right now about your business, whether that's good or bad, because there's so, as I've learned as a business owner, like your finances and the money and profit and loss, like it is often tied to how am I feeling about my business.
Mm-hmm.
It can be an indicator of something's off or something is on. But the good news is that there's data. I love when there's data. There's data to look at. And instead of maybe if something's off, saying like, "Oh, I'm just doing terribly," or "Yeah, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
failure," you can. It sounds like you're coming at an approach of like, well, let's see what these numbers teach us and what do they tell us, so that you can hopefully, change that story.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it for sure. And what I see so often is our guts are so wrong about finances.
Mm,
Like we can feel a month was great or a month was terrible. And sometimes what happens from that is I talk to practice owners like, Nate, I honestly don't want to look at the numbers this month. Like I just know it's not going to be good. I would rather just not look at it. Or
mm,
they might even feel like shame. Like I
yeah.
feel shameful about where the business is financially. It's like, hey,
Hmm.
there's no shame here. Like, let's just take a look at it. It's a no shame game. Just see where
Hmm.
we are and let's see what's next. But yeah, our kind of gut instinct can be wrong pretty often with finances. There's a lot of times where a practice owner will say that before our meeting, and then we'll meet. They're like, "Oh, it actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was,"
Yeah.
or "Oh, it's because we had three payrolls this month. That only happens twice a year. Like, that's actually not a big deal. That's just kind of the
Hmm.
cycle, right?" So I found that when we look at a financial story, it actually alleviates a lot of the stress and shame that might be felt by the practice owner.
Yeah.
Um, and I've even felt that with my own business, where I'm like, something changed drastically in the business. Like this is going to be like I might think, oh, this is going to be a tight month. And then I look at the numbers like, oh, it actually was okay. So I think
Yeah.
just like you said, having that data, looking at it and figuring out what's causing what we're seeing can actually make you feel a lot more confident where the business is and be like, all right, we're not drowning. We're okay. Like, let's take some action steps and move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also shows of just the importance of having someone like yourself, like outside the business, whose sole responsibility and also just skill and joy is to look at these numbers and to find that story. Because we make up our own stories, especially when we're so close to our finances. It's just like, well, what's in the bank account? Well, not a lot, so I must be doing terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing that I've been learning too with like my own team, such as something like search engine optimization, where if we've recently hired someone who is great at looking at the data and seeing what is the story saying about, how is your visibility. And, if you don't have somebody who's really into that, then like I said, you're going to start making up your own stories,
Right.
and just kind of normalizing that story in your head. But it's so helpful when someone who's outside doesn't have all the emotions tied up in it, is just like, there as a guide to guide folks through those numbers.
I love that for your industry too, because to me, as someone who's not savvy at all on, SEO, design, anything like that, it's like it feels like just an area where I understand nothing. I'm like, people are like, oh, you got to optimize your SEO. I'm like, I have literally no idea how to do that. You know, like is it even a real thing? So I love with your industry that you're like getting into that data because I feel like that's so helpful for people like me who don't understand it. I'm sure with your clients too, where it's like, hey, here's the data, here's the changes that are happening, here's a change we made that is now affecting this, and
Yeah.
just getting into those numbers is so helpful. And that's, yeah, maybe a good parallel to how people feel about the finances as well. Like you said, of like, when you're not in it, it feels so foreign, right?
Yeah.
Of like, how do I even understand these metrics and these numbers? So
Yeah.
whether it's finance or SEO, it's probably kind of a similar feeling for practice owners in some ways.
Yeah, because the data, it doesn't lie. It's just like either you have website traffic or you don't, or you're seeing income coming into the business or not, or expenses are too high uh related to the income, so it helps you then create data informed decisions about what are you going to do about your business
Mm-hmm.
to increase your profits or minimize your expenses, stuff like that.
Right.
I love data.
Yeah.
I'm not always good at reading the data myself, but that kind of goes back to, like we got to have people in our business that we
Right.
that love what they do, related to those specific things. And that's been just a journey for myself in scaling.
Mm,
I didn't have a bookkeeper until about maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and I started my business about 6 years ago as well. And it's just it's part of that growth. And you realize, okay, I think I
right.
need somebody who can help me see what I'm not seeing. And so
Hmm.
that's why folks like yourself exist, and we're all happy for that. So thank you. Well,
Yeah.
let's get into a little bit more about, we talked about, before the call here about just the nuances of scaling, going from like
Hmm.
solo to maybe you're building a team, you're starting to take on clinicians. And, what are some of the things that either people don't recognize that they should take care of, or things that trip people up as, in sort of the financial bookkeeping sense, that kind of keeps
Hmm.
them, in that place of being a little bit less prepared to scale.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great way of thinking about it. And I think with data in general, it's something where kind of like you're saying, you want to add it in pieces, right? Where it's not something that you need to necessarily add in all the tools and all the professionals
Hmm.
all at once. As you scale, I think it's kind of like, all right, we're now ready to add this in.
Yeah.
Um, because I think sometimes you can actually get to a point where you have too much data, too many tools, too many spreadsheets, and you're like, how do all these work
Yeah.
together? Right.
Yeah.
We've seen that where it's like we have all these cool spreadsheets, but like, how do we use them in a way that I can actually make decisions from them? Right.
Right.
So yeah, it's sometimes just thinking like, what's my biggest need right now? Where's my biggest blind spot? That's another term that I use sometimes is financial blind spots, right? And there are those things in
Hmm.
our businesses where we see a number or we see some trend that's happening. We don't know why it's happening. We don't know why the number is the way it is. It's like, how do we eliminate as many of those blind spots as possible so we can feel more confident in the business where we see a number and we're like, all right, I know why that number is there, whether it's good or
Hmm.
bad. And when we have those blind spots, that's one of the worst feelings. If you look at your payroll and your payroll's all of a sudden up by $5,000, you didn't expect it. It's like, whoa, what's happening here, right? Or if revenue drops down, if you know you lost 5 clients, it's like, okay, I don't feel that bad about that. If you have no idea why that's happening, you also have panic.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it as you scale and grow the business is thinking about where are those blind spots and how can I start to fill those in so I have less of them in the business, and which kind of tools or services can come in to help me eliminate as many of those blind spots. So I'd say, to answer your question, probably the biggest one as practices scale that we see comes down to pay structures with clinicians. So
Mm.
as you add that
Yeah.
team, especially if you're going from solo to a group practice or from a small group practice to a medium to large group practice, you might have a situation where you're having to figure out, how do I use different pay structures? How do I pay people who are uh, in different spots of their clinical journey, right? Someone who's new right out of school, someone who's very experienced. How do I
Yeah.
compensate all those people in a way that's fair to them, ethical, but also still profitable for the business so
Hmm.
that we can be sustainable and keep giving those people jobs, right?
Yeah.
So that can be probably the biggest blind spot, and probably also one of the biggest indicators of whether you're going to be profitable or not profitable in your practice. So what we have and what we like to share, and I'll give you the link for this. You can put it in the show notes. But we have a tool that your audience can download if they'd like, called the Clinician Profitability Tool.
Cool.
And what that helps you do, and I'll share a video with it as well. So there's kind of a tutorial to walk through it. But what it helps you do is figure out, how are each of my clinicians being paid, and does
Hmm.
that make sense for them and for the practice, right? So basically, put in some numbers, put in revenue coming in by the clinician, their current pay structure, visits, all those things, and you'll figure out what's kind of the profit margin per clinician, and where do we want that to be. We usually want that to be around 20% per clinician. So if they bring in $10,000 in revenue, we want the practice to be keeping at least $2,000 after everything's been paid, clinician,
Hmm.
overhead expenses, everything like that. It can be more than that, but that's where we want it to be at baseline.
Yeah.
So a tool like that can be really helpful just in figuring out, hey, where are our pay structures? Are we overpaying? Are we underpaying? Is the person who's really experienced like not profitable, while the people who are right out of school super profitable? Like, how does that all work together, right?
Yeah.
And that comes down to just that data we've been talking about, just how visible is the data and where are we. So first step is just using a tool like that. You don't have to use our tool. There's other tools out there like that, but figuring out just where are our pay structures, how are we paying people, and then from that point, then figuring out how do we start to tweak these to optimize them, right?
Hmm.
So that, and it's not a matter of like squeezing profit out of clinicians. We don't want to do that. Just a matter of how do we get in that Goldilocks zone where people are being paid really well, being retained, but also the practice is sustainable as far as profit
Yeah.
goes. So, if someone is at like 5% profit, it's like, okay, is there maybe a different incentive we can start using or a different type of pay structure? Maybe there's a bonus that comes in or a step up on a tiered ladder once they see more visits, starting to think and be creative about pay structures to help get in that great spot of optimization. So it really gets into a point of like being really creative and flexible, which is cool with pay structures in private practices. There's a lot of different ways you can go, a lot of different kind of incentives and structures that can be put in place. So just starting to think through those and be like, is there a different way we could do this that could make more sense for us and for the clinician? So that tool is really helpful just in kind of starting off and covering some of those blind spots on the pay structure side.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And that actually reminds me of my wife kind of walked through this and she started hiring a team, had a very similar experience in that um when she started to get more data and getting more into the bookkeeping, she realized, oh, I need to be I need to increase my profit margins like on my clinicians, there when you start to understand expenses related. And it took some time to kind of dig into that and figure all that stuff out. But again, kind of going back to the data, she learned once she kind of saw the full picture of that, like, oh, I'm not really making much profit at all on like this clinicians or these clinicians, and so she just in the last year had to kind of work those pay structures and figure out what was working. And and it's not to say that she did wrong. It was because she came from, oh, I worked at a place and this was kind of how they structured it,
Mm-hmm.
and so you kind of
Right.
go off of some of that. You're just kind of you're figuring out like, oh well, that's how they structured it, let me see how that could work in my business. Which is a helpful starting point. But then
Yeah.
what we're talking about today is then you can tweak those and really optimize those when you have good information and good data to make sure that
Mm-hmm.
it is profitable.
Right. No, that's exactly it. I just talked to a practice owner who had a similar situation. They had a pay structure. They took it from their previous employer, just started utilizing it. And I was like, hey, you're paying these people really, really well, like really highly. And they're like, I thought that was normal. I was like, no, this is not normal. This is like 5 to 10 percentage points above average or even more
Mm,
than that. Right. So you don't know what you don't know.
yeah.
So it's just helpful just to get the data and start, like you said, you're gonna have a starting point. There's no shame in that, but
Yeah.
let's just keep getting it to a better place that works well. So
Yeah, and the benefit that brings up just like another great benefit of working with someone like yourself is you're working with multiple private practices, and so there sometimes it's we get our blinders on of like, oh, this is how I'm going to do it, and this worked, for this other place I worked at. But kind of what are other people doing? What are your Nate? What are the profitable practices you work with? How are they structuring it? And that
mhm,
that feedback I think is really really helpful as well.
right. Yeah. It's a fun part of niching down, right? So
Yeah.
so yeah, the clinician profitability tool is a good one. I'd say, your question as far as other kind of blind spots or areas, I think it's one really helpful thing to implement is just to have some sort of dashboard, honestly.
Mm.
A dashboard meaning what are just kind of our metrics we want to keep our eye on. Mike McAllowitz, who wrote Profit First, also wrote a book called Clockwork. And a lot of clockwork
Yeah.
is about, do you have some sort of dashboard just tracking your most important metrics? And this doesn't have to be just a financial dashboard, but financial pieces can definitely be in there. But tracking retention of clients, tracking revenue, tracking profit, tracking expenses. You can kind of pick and choose which ones are important to you at your phase of the business. But especially like you said, when practices are really starting to scale, it gets to that point where it's hard to keep an eye on everything.
Yeah.
So having some sort of dashboard is really helpful just to be like, okay, at a glance, where are we? I don't have to
Yeah.
spend 50 minutes on it. I can just spend 10, just be like, cool, where are we right now? How is that compared to the last 3 months? All right, feels good or feels bad, whatever it is, but at least you know where you are. So
Yeah.
coming up with some simple dashboard, it doesn't have to be fancy. The one I use for my own business is literally just a spreadsheet. It has no formatting or anything. It just has like 10 metrics that I look at every month. I'm like,
Yep.
cool, how are we doing on these?
Yep.
And it just gives me a really helpful view of like exactly where I am. So so for practices, I think it's the same thing. It's figuring out what are the metrics we need to be tracking and how do we just put those in a dashboard, a simple dashboard, so we can see where we're at and then make changes as needed. And that's a quick one. That's maybe one that will only take 5-10 minutes a month, but I think it can really give that helpful kind of comprehensive view of financial health and the financial story in the business.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I encourage people all the time. I'm not really on like the financial side of things, but like when people are they're wondering like, oh, conversions, I get this many calls, but I'm not sure how well they convert. And, it's always like you need a spreadsheet, you need to track it. That's always like my go-to, and even in my own business, I'm like I feel a little out of control with maybe it's like sales calls, increasing sales calls. Like, well, I
Mhm.
need a spreadsheet. I need to track how many calls I'm having each month, what's the conversion, all that sort of stuff. And I find it so helpful to have that place that you can go to. And yeah, so I just encourage people if you're listening, just to get some data down in a spreadsheet and start tracking some things because you can't improve things if you don't measure it and you kind of
Right.
know where you're at.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And just make it simple, right? Like you said, it doesn't have to be complex. Just start writing it down and then you can make it more complex from there. I mean, there's beautiful dashboards you can get. We have these like kind of fancy dashboards we give to our clients, but like those look nice, but it's still going to be the same data, right? It's
Yeah,
like just
right.
get the data down and that's the important thing. And then you can
Yeah.
always beautify it in the future. So
Yeah, absolutely. We do a similar thing too with our SEO clients. We're pulling in like their website traffic, their SEO
mhm.
keyword rankings, their Google business inquiries, like all this stuff. And it looks super cool and everything, but it's really just like we just need to be organized really at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's like you just have to have access to that data. And if it takes you, an hour to go over here and over there and pull it in, then sometimes that people can get overwhelmed by that. So I say
Right.
start small, spreadsheet totally works.
hmm Yeah.
Awesome. Well, are there any other like last words of advice that you want to give folks, when it comes to your bookkeeping and scaling your practice?
I mean, I could talk for hours, so I won't do that. But yeah, I think that kind of key point that you just said there is probably the key thing. Like, just start tracking it and knowing where your data is, right? So, there's many tools out there that you can use, like the clinician profitability tool, like a dashboard, and just starting to keep track of your data is the most important thing. So, make
Yeah.
sure that you're just knowing where the numbers are, right? So whether that's pulling your financial reports and just taking a quick look at those every month, whether that's working with someone and consulting with them, it's all kind of different tiers of like how much support you need. And I think it comes
Yeah.
down to kind of how interested or engaged you are in the numbers. If you're someone who's never going to look at the numbers on your own, you probably should work with someone. If you're like, hey, I
Yeah.
like the numbers, I enjoy that, that's great. Then maybe just try to structure in some spreadsheets that you look at or having a little bit of a process. I obviously love numbers, but I even have a process for myself at the end of the month. What do I need to look at? Because it's easy to let my own business finances go by the wayside. I'm like, oh, I'm doing all the
Yeah.
client stuff, but my own business goes by the wayside. And I'm someone who does this all the time. So
Right.
for someone who's a practice owner who, may not enjoy the finances as much, I'd say come up with a little bit of a process, just like, okay, I fill out this dashboard, I look at this tool, I pull a couple of financial reports. It can be 30, 45 minutes a month. That's all you really need to have a good view
Hmm.
of where you are. And once you get a good idea of where you are, and then you can start looking at those trends in that financial story and figuring out, okay, we're right here right now. We want to be here. How do we start moving in that right direction? Is that changing pay structures? We didn't get into cash flow at all, but that's another big piece as far as how is our cash flow? How are we setting money aside for taxes, for savings? That's super difficult to do, but really important to do as well. So,
Yeah.
just trying to track as many of those kind of important metrics as you can, probably 5 to 7 of them, and then just start making small tweaks over time to keep moving the business in a more financially healthy place. So I think, yeah, that data is the key part. Just start recording data and then you can kind of build on it from there. It doesn't have to be perfect from the beginning, it just has to be a start.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been super helpful, Nate. I know I've learned a lot and really love sort of the practicality of some of the things that we talked about. Your teaching ways have come across. I feel like you teach this stuff really well and love the way that you present it. So thanks so much for being on the show. Why don't you tell folks where people can learn a little bit more about you and your services?
Yeah, yeah. Like you said, website's probably the best place. That's navigatorbookkeeping.us. So you can check us out there. And yeah, we have a YouTube channel as well. Talk about a lot of private practice, bookkeeping, accounting, consulting pieces on there. So YouTube's always fun. Otherwise, we have a blog on the website as well. But yeah, those would be the best places. Even better than social media, I think, is just go to the source, go to the website, and you can check
Yeah.
us out from there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.